Please support me on Patreon. Link is in the description below.
So, what's on your mind, my friend? Also, what should chat call you and pronouns?
Frederick and they, them. But yeah, the reason I'm kind of emailed you was your takes on the German-Soviet Axis talks that you've mentioned a few times. Mostly your framing of it, because it seems to mostly pop up in, discussions with tankies where you kind of want to frame, the Soviet Union as red fash, which I find very reasonable overall. But then you start getting into territories where it's like, well, they wanted an alliance and then it only fell apart because, Stalin was greedy. And I think that framing is kind of weird. Yeah, and that's mostly what I wanted to talk about.
Yeah, okay. Well, I'm happy to have my understanding of history expanded. So, as I understand it, right, the Soviets did not want a war with Germany. They were aware of the fact that they were ideologically opposed to Germany, at least on paper. Obviously, I don't think highly of the Soviet Union's definition of communism. And for that reason, like Stalin and other leaders in the Soviet Union were trying to preemptively capitulate to prevent an invasion, which of course ended up happening anyway. And while the agreement that was eventually settled on was, of course, like they get to divide Poland in half and they don't fight each other and so on, there were initial efforts for them to carve out and like predetermine a larger swath of territory that would be separated and sort of kept together. And I mean, this kind of functionally makes them an Axis member if they do this. I mean, they're an ally in the sense that they're fighting against the same countries at the same times. They're in a defensive, or sorry, not defensive, they're in a military alliance because they're coordinating their efforts. And from what I read, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but, Hitler and the Germans were unhappy with how much territory Stalin demanded because the Soviet Union was considered kind of a backwater compared to Western European nations, and he didn't think they deserved that much. So a lot of the stuff didn't end up going through.
Yeah, I would largely agree with that summarization of the topic. I think one of the big things we might disagree on is the meaning of the word ally. Like, to me, an alliance, especially if we're talking a military alliance, requires some form of agreement of mutual, like, defense or something along those lines. Would you agree?
I mean, I guess it depends on the pragmatics, right? That's like Germany was allies with Japan, but it couldn't send people over to go help Japan against the U.S. Pacific invasion. I mean, maybe, I guess when I normally think of two countries being allies, I would think of them having a mutual defensive alliance too, but that's not always true either, right? Like, the United States did not immediately get up to intervene when France was taken over, but we're undeniably allies with them.
Oh yeah, definitely, and I think that's a valid example. The the thing I would say is I would more frame it along the lines of like I am also the sort of person who vehemently disagrees with the Soviet Union, and I would more frame it like Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union were both very much imperialist powers at the time. They were empires who wanted to expand further and were carving up spheres of influence and were expanding in the same direction. And to me, when I kind of have gone through and read like the details of the German-Soviet Axis talks and stuff like that, it pretty much just comes down to two imperialist powers carving up spheres of influence. It's like, let's stay out of each other's way for now. And to me, that does not, like, to call that an alliance to me is kind of like a reach.
I guess. I mean, I guess the implication then is like if Germany hadn't betrayed the Soviet Union and invaded anyway, like how long would the Soviet Union have been content to be de facto allies to the Axis powers? I mean, past the point, it feels like it's just semantics, right? Because even sincere allies can infight. It seems like the Soviet Union was, I don't know, pretty happy with the arrangement they had, which is why it took Germany's betrayal to break it.
Yeah, but that's kind of the point. Like, I haven't read up on these sources in a long time. I'm basing this mostly off a few talks I remember watching a long time ago by Stephen Kotkin, and he very much frames it in the way that like both the Soviet Union and Germany knew that war was going to happen at some point. The only question was when. Both nations could agree that we don't want to make war at this point, and both were kind of just waiting for the right opportunity. Like the Soviet Union, the main thing that was really, weird about Stalin was that he was convinced that the war wouldn't start until the UK had surrendered. He believed that like the Soviet Union was going to be out of the war until the West had been completely knocked out, and then a war would take place. That is what made the Soviet Union be taken by such surprise. And I think that that was like a sign of, Stalin's woeful misunderstanding of the situation. But like, I don't think that if Germany had never broken the agreement, they would just have been at like perpetual peace or anything.
Yeah, but I mean, this this seems kind of like a semantic difference, right? Because in the meantime, they're functionally acting as allies, um, not just with a non-aggression pact, but acting in the hopes of like splitting territory and coordinating military action against victim countries. It's like I guess I agree that things weren't going to be rosy forever, but in the meantime, that does still kind of make them functional allies, right? And I don't think a
Yeah.
good communist would ever excuse the behavior of the Soviet Union on the idea that, like, well, they were acting and operating and invading as an ally of Nazi Germany for years. But in the long run, they were going to turn on that.
Oh, yeah. I am just a big fan of history. I'm not defending this on the basis that I support the Soviet Union or anything. I am not a fan of the Soviet Union at all. I would largely call myself a democratic socialist with a lot of sympathy for anarchists. So, yeah, I'm not a big fan of the Soviet Union during any era of its history. They coordinated military actions, but to a very limited extent, to the point where they partitioned Poland, but they actually clashed in Poland. Soviet and German troops fought when German troops overran the deal they had made for the partition, and German troops continued into, well, areas that they had promised to the Soviet Union that just happened to contain oil fields that, that Germany really wanted at the time.
Not, I mean, fair weather allies to be sure then. I guess I just don't feel comfortable calling it exclusively a non-aggression pact, even though that's how people frame the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It wasn't just them not invading each other, coordinating an invasion of a country, even if it was messily done. Like that's a lot, like that's a pretty big that's a pretty big commitment of efforts. Certainly I don't think Poland would feel comfortable referring to it exclusively as a non-aggression pact. If you're predetermining like where the lines of conflict are supposed to end, you're not just not fighting with each other. You're doing active military coordination.
Oh, yeah, I think it seems we're mostly coming down to like kind of a semantic
It
argument
seems, yeah,
because to me,
semantics mostly.
yeah, because to me the main thing would be like, yeah, I'm not excusing the Soviet Union. They were both kind of like trying to agree on how do we split our imperialist spheres, which, yeah, no, that's nothing I will support. But to me, that's the thing. Like, to me, it's not an alliance when two powers that generally have very contradictory interests temporarily agree that, at this very moment, we might coordinate and work together to like, at this moment, our spheres don't clash, so we'll work together very temporarily. To me, that's like the definition of a non aggression pact, right?
Well, if it's in addition to other stuff like coordinating where like the lines of invasion are supposed to end, and like saying that they should go split their aggression in different directions. I think it definitely goes beyond that. Like I would argue, for example, that the Soviet Union was functionally an ally of the Allied powers after Hitler invaded them, even though we were in the exact same position with them, right? After the invasion from Germany, when, you know, things eventually settled, we coordinated with the Soviets and invaded Germany from both halves. We partitioned it down the line, and then we would, fully knowing on both sides that we would end up being enemies with each other, and, you know, then the Cold War started. But I would still say that, like, from a certain point onward, the Soviet Union was functionally an ally of the Allied powers, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Though I would say that the extent of the Soviet Union and the Allies' military cooperation went a lot further. Like, the Allies, the Allies shared a lot more information with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union shared a lot more in turn than the Soviet Union or Germany ever did. And that's sort of the point, that Germany and the Soviet Union only ever coordinated to the extent where they carved a line for where the conquest should take place. Whereas the Allies, for example, they provided information to the Soviet Union that was crucial for the Battle of Kursk, for example, basically giving the exact details for when the Germans were planning on attacking, because the Allies were further ahead than the Soviet Union in terms of like hacking and cracking, you know, German information.
Do you think they would have done the same thing with the Polish if the Polish hadn't been able to be, like, rolled over in no time at all?
No, I don't think so. Like they literally clashed in Poland because their coordination was so bad.
I can acknowledge maybe that there was a higher degree of cooperation with the Allied powers, but I would still call it, like, ultimately a semantic line. I could not accept the Molotov-Ribbentrop as just non-aggression, especially since they tried to do more, right? The Soviet counter-proposal with the, like, proposed land deals and such.
Yeah,
It definitely marks more than just an agreement not to fight.
yeah. We can get into the other thing here, which is the framing that like Stalin was too greedy, because from the same perspective, couldn't you just say that Hitler was too greedy?
Yeah, well, I
Like,
mean, I agree with that, certainly. But I'm
all right,
usually using this argument when I'm talking with tankies, not Nazis.
yeah, all right. So that was what I wanted to also like get clarified, whether it's used mostly rhetorically against tankies, which totally makes sense to me, or whether it's a genuine belief that like the Soviets were greedier than the Nazis, which to me would come off a little bit weird.
No, no, I just think the idea, because if the argument, because the argument a lot of tankies make is that the Soviets were forced into doing this because
Yeah,
they couldn't weather an invasion, which I don't think is an acceptable excuse for collaborating with the literal Nazi party. But even if it was, that argument is also kind of destroyed by the fact that they were trying to, like, bid deals for land and coordinated invasion as well. Like, because it would be one thing to go for the Soviet Union to be like, please do not fucking invade me right now, while they're, like, you know, training their men and printing guns out of their factories. But it's entirely a different thing for them to be negotiating about how much, like, land they want to split down the middle of the Eurasian, you know, divide. And for the Nazis to get frustrated at how much they wanted,
yeah,
because that definitely makes it seem a lot less like it's just them trying to preserve their own existence.
yeah. I actually thought of another thing of where I consider the German Soviet alliance to be weaker than the one with the Allies, which is quite simply that there are literally documentation that Stalin and the Soviet Union were like upset at how well Germany did in France. Like there was no similar thing with like D-Day happens and the Soviet Union is upset that they're doing pretty well on the Western Front. Like to me, that pretty clearly shows that like the Soviet Union is actively worried by their quote unquote ally doing too well. But what I was going to say is also I fully agree with you that like Yankees really like to portray it as if this was like some desperate thing they were forced to do, which no, really not. Like the Soviet Union could have settled for just like the partitioning of territory and a non-aggression pact, but they agreed to trade deals. They supplied Germany with oil and like oil was the main thing Germany lacked throughout the entire war.
Well,
Um, so,
it
oh
makes
yeah,
sense that they wouldn't be happy with how quickly France fell because the Soviet Union was kind of hoping that Germany would stall out in the Western Front and
yeah.
therefore not be available to invade them. Would you be comfortable then, I guess, with saying like they acted as allies rather than they were allies? Because even if like their long-term behavior ended up degrading because they had mutually exclusive interests, in the meantime, for like a period of a couple years, they basically did act. Like there wasn't that much of a functional difference from the perspective of other countries between that of like Germany's relationship with Italy or Japan, even if those relationships wouldn't degrade the way that it did with the Soviet Union. It was like a short-term, temporary, fair-weather ally that either side would only tolerate for as long as they could to prevent that front of the war from opening up.
But yeah, I would think that's a pretty fair description. Like yeah, they effectively, to me, they weren't allies, even if they had accepted the German-Soviet Axis talks, since there was, Italy and Germany coordinated military actions. Even in the German-Soviet Axis talks, there was no talk of like unified military action. But like effectively, like they had a non-aggression pact, they had the economic trade agreements, and to that end, I but to me, that's a non-aggression pact. Like they were using that non-aggression pact to like also earn positive trade agreements and hoping that the world war would go on for as long as possible, because I'm sure they were happy with both Germany being stalled out in a war and the UK being bombarded by the Nazis.
Then I would
But
definitely
yeah,
settle it like acted as allies for a time. Because I definitely can't interpret that just as non-aggression. Because when I think non-aggression pact, literally just do not invade. Anything more than that is joint military action, even if it's poorly coordinated.
all right. Yeah, I think we just have slightly different definitions of like what
Even if,
constitutes an alliance. Yeah.
as long as we agree the Soviet Union was bad.
Oh yeah, we very much do. The Soviet Union, like the Soviet Union was at the time an extremely imperialist power. The entire point of why the agreement doesn't work is because neither country is willing to let go of like the idea of having Bulgaria as a puppet state. Like both of them were dead set on conquering like all of like Europe pretty much and beyond. So yeah, no, that's not something I'll support.
Well, that's good to know. Probably the one and only non-idiotic conversation I'm ever going to have in anything associated with the relationship between Germany and the Soviet Union.
Oh
Um,
yeah, I could imagine some red flags when I went up in your head when I sent that email.
I do appreciate you coming on.
Oh yeah, thanks.
I think I have to, since I guess this, whatever disagreement we have at this point is largely semantic, I have to talk about issues in which my disagreements with other people are definitely not semantic in nature.
Yeah, I was going to ask if we could talk about a couple of other topics about market socialism, but if you're busy with other topics, I understand that as well.
Oh, do you disagree on anything that I've said?
No, it was mostly like going to ask about a few things of like market socialism in practice and how that will work out. For example, representative democracy versus direct democracy.
I mean, I think
If
that it would probably have to be representative democracy for larger corporations, right? Especially if you're talking about multiple like franchises or branch offices or, you know, God willing, something global or just beyond a single nation. I don't think it's possible for 10,000 or 100,000 workers to like directly vote on decisions that would be operating at that scale. So I guess it would just be you'd have to like determine an acceptable threshold for representative democracy, like if having, I don't know, 10 people to a level is acceptable, or if you could go to 100 or even 1,000 without it much being an issue.
Oh yeah, I was mostly thinking in like terms of like if a nation moves to the point where it's like moving towards market socialism, like everything is now worker co-ops and stuff like that. Um, I think I remember watching a video where you described representative democracy as cringe, quote unquote. And to me, like one of the main things that popped up in my head is why, when I imagine what's bad about representative democracy, I mostly think about things like, very rich capitalists lobbying. I think about things like politicians having very different class interests to the average worker. And within a system where, like, we've pretty much gotten rid of the bourgeoisie, the question would be, like, how many of the issues of, like, representative democracy do you think would be solved by, like, simply implementing market socialism?
I mean, the biggest problem with representative democracy as it stands now is because it's almost guaranteed that the people you elect are of a different class position than you are, right? The vast
Yeah.
majority of people are always going to be workers in a capitalist system, but generally speaking, the people who have the money and the resources to run for office and succeed, with all the ad buys, and because, you need money to succeed, it's not enough to simply have money yourself. You have to be in the favor of people who also have money. You're almost always going to be voting in people who pretend at your interest but have their own, right? I mean, ideally, if you're directly voting in workers from your own branch or company, and they're beholden to them directly. I don't know. I feel like that system would just innately align the interests of the representative leaders and the people who are voting for them, at least a lot more than they are now. I mean, it would definitely like bring it in closer.
Yeah. Um, on that topic, similarly, like, getting or achieving market socialism would get rid of class as we know it, and by that I mean, like, there would be no one, like, living on the extraction of other people's labor. However, there would still be pretty significant income disparities, like if we just had a similar system to what we have today in terms of, like, income taxes and stuff like that, because some co-ops would be vastly more successful than others, and, like, individual artists, writers, and other stuff like that would still, like, be able to achieve probably vast amounts of wealth. Like, what efforts would you support to, like, or do you think we should support efforts to, like, control that income disparity to a large extent, like under market socialism, to, like, get rid of that, like, class inequality?
I don't think it would be as much of an issue, probably because without like profiting off the labor of others, conceptually, I don't know how wealthy a person could be. I guess you'd have edge cases. I don't know. Somebody could always stumble into a well and find a giant diamond. There's always some edge case example of a person being able to become incredibly wealthy almost entirely off their own work. I don't know how much social harm there would be. Things would be leveled out to the point that I don't think you could argue a ton of resources would be meaningfully like directed towards them as a separate income class. And I don't know if there'd be a way to reify their political power, because if you're already wealthy due to the success of the industry that you're a worker in, or just through circumstance, or you just happen to like have a one-man business that got super popular, whatever, even if all of that happened, I don't know what like laws you could push, what you could lobby for that would make your group as a monetary class rather than like a relation to the means of production class like distinct and more powerful. Apart from just basic stuff like lowering taxes, but overwhelmingly people will be voting in favor of tax systems that favor, I don't know, the majority. It just seems like they'd be stripped of a lot of their ability to fuck things up in a democratic sense.
Oh yeah, I definitely agree that it would be less of an issue, but let's say, like, a super successful author like Stephen King or someone like that, their wealth isn't really made through the extraction of other people's labor, right?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, and, like, within that system, you would still have a much smaller population, but still a population of, like, people who are, like, wealthy millionaires or billionaires if we had a system similar to what we have today. And yeah, I think that, like, yeah, it's just something I think about a lot, is like, how do we, is that an issue that will have to be addressed? And in that case, how do we address that? Is there a way to, like, put a cap on total wealth in a way that would, like, make sense, do you think?
Yeah, well, Bernie Sanders has even argued for a wealth cap. I'm totally fine with that. Even if stuff like that never got implemented, though, I just don't think it would be that harmful. The existence of those people wouldn't be harmful in the way they are now because they couldn't operate as part of a separate class.
Yeah. Can I ask about one final thing?
Well, sure.
This might be a fun, spicy one. Um, okay, let's start with this lead in. Do you think that socialism can be achieved in one country or a small collection of countries while capitalism still exists?
Probably not. No.
Yep, okay. I would agree with that, but to some extent, nations can of course move towards socialism before like capitalism has been removed, right?
Yeah, I just don't think they can decommodify. The
Oh yeah,
decommodification is the thing that I don't think that would have to be like a global switchover. Everything else could be done incrementally.
I agree with that assessment. The main thing I was thinking of is like the concept of military and defense under like our transition towards socialism. Like, let's say America managed some form of revolution and turned way more socialist. Um, Basically, do you think that the concept of the military at that one point we need like a big reform? Because, for example, I hear a lot of lefties advocating for basically the equivalent of like community defense as like a valid like defensive strategy for like a revolution. Would you agree with that? Or like what is the role of like the military as it exists now in a post like revolution?
Yeah, I think those suggestions are really dumb and naive, you know?
Yeah.
The idea that, like, you could somehow achieve global socialism through, like, a Zapatistas or a Rojava situation just 1,000 times over all over the world is just really, really, really dumb. We have nukes, we have modern drones, like, none of that's, yeah. There no local community defense can do anything meaningful other than resist occupation, but you know, resisting occupation and resisting total economic collapse are two separate things, right? America couldn't conquer Afghanistan, but America can bomb it into the Stone Age. And we did, and the Soviets did too. We did the same thing with Vietnam. Just be like, if you want to try like little revolutionary cells as a way of defending socialism in one country or a group of countries before everyone's willing to get on board, the only thing you're going to invite then is like the total cessation of your military in favor of being carpet bombed by countries that would really rather not have you be a positive example for socialism, which would probably include us. Um, yeah, you can't do that. As long as you're making moves towards socialism in any capacity, any incremental reform, the upkeep of a strong, robust military is essential. Ideally, you would do things in a way that actually keeps the imperial core off your back, right? Like, um, you know, like even Rojava, and not as though we're good friends to the Kurds. We literally funded the genocide Saddam Hussein committed against them. But, you
Yeah.
know, conceptually, right, like we had troops stationed there protecting Rojava positions because of ISIS. There are probably geopolitical situations where it would be possible to sort of lean on a lighter military by not provoking the imperial core. But yeah, I don't know. I just think it's probably a good idea to keep a strong military.
Oh yeah, that's like I agreed with basically all of that because mostly the thing I find super weird is like where I understand where they're coming from, where of course lefties are very suspicious of any institution that holds like a ton of centralized power. Not surprising considering the military has traditionally not been super kind to leftists. However, that's the sort of thing where, like, I think a lot of people, when they're imagining the socialist revolution and how it would work, imagine that we're basically that we're in a military stage of like 100 years ago when everyone was still relying on like carrying firearms and everything, or like largely small arms is still what's defining warfare.
Well,
In
all of the,
those eras,
all,
oh
I
yeah,
mean,
sorry.
all of the like military history that these lefties tend to be familiar with are the Soviet and Maoist revolutions, right? Like they,
Yeah.
and at those times, like you know, they operated completely differently, and they don't seem to have an understanding of how things have shifted since then. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. Like militias were a lot more valid in the past, but like we have such a reliance on army professionalism, like tanks, aircraft, drones. Like you can't just train a militiaman to do that. But that leads into the bigger issue of like, well, how do you stop a potential military from then just cooing a revolutionary society? if you then have that sort of like professionalized, centralized military.
Well, I mean, you can't without it. There's literally no way. There's no organized defense against modern warfare. It's just not a thing. Apart from resisting occupation, but again, that's not like the only thing you should strive for, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, Afghanistan's not doing too great. It resisted occupation, you know, we see where that led. It wasn't enough.
Oh yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think just a lot of lefties have some pretty wacky ideas. And I just wanted to see how much you agree with some of those ideas that I find a little bit weird. But yeah, I would largely agree with basically everything we've said here. Yeah.
No easy paths forward, I'm afraid. But no, I think we agree on pretty much everything.
Yep. Well, yeah, this was a very pleasant chat. I really enjoyed it.
Probably the only one I'll have today. Thank you.
Yeah,
I do appreciate it.
Sorry to the chat for not offering blood sports or anything.
It's okay. They don't deserve them anyway. They've been bad to me lately. I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you. Are you all right with me shouting out my channel?
Of course.
I have a very small YouTube channel called Frederick Ensio, ENSIO, where I mostly discuss cool stuff like trans rights issues and stuff like that. And yeah, come over and subscribe if you found me reasonable.
Thank you very much. I've heard of these trans people. I've heard about them before. You know, they're up to some pretty crazy shit.
Yeah, I mostly have done some videos. I've done a few shorts about, you know, trans people throughout history and like mostly pointing out that, you know, yeah, they've always existed and been pretty cool. And yeah.
I hope you have a wonderful day.
Yeah, I hope so too. I hope you have a wonderful day.
We'll be playing games later, so, you know, maybe there's a chance still. Take care.
Yeah. Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for watching. A post-discussion video where I elaborate on some of my thoughts on this topic will be coming soon. Special thanks to Vaush for letting me upload his recording. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and have a lovely day.